and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode with Wealth Advice. I'm Matthew and I'm joined by Joe again, and today we're going to be focusing on defined benefit pensions, sometimes called final salary pensions, career average pensions, essentially those pensions that are guaranteed for life rather than a pot of money that builds up over time. So jumping into it today, which sort of people have defined benefit pensions? That can be teachers, people in the NHS, people like firemen. And what do they have to think about? Well, they have to think about the different sorts of pensions that they've built up and what options they have available. Joe and I are often talking about the value of different pensions, and defined benefit pensions are classed as that Rolls-Royce pension because it's inflation linked, it's guaranteed for life, and there's no investment risk. So as a starting point, that can be a brilliant pension. And in today's episode, we're going to chat through the pros and cons of this type of pension and how it can be used with other pensions. So Joe, what do you think is the main sort of areas that people should be thinking about when they're looking at these sorts of pensions?
Yeah, I suppose the main sense from a retirement point of view is that they are a guaranteed income. So it does allow you to essentially plan and look at your retirement that way. Generally, we like to see clients that have got both a mix of guaranteed income through defined benefit final salary schemes and also flexible pensions, which we've touched upon on previous episodes. In reality, it's probably a case of most people either have one or the other, and occasionally there's a mix that can work quite well. Just sort of starting off by looking at defined benefit pensions, I suppose a good place to start is how they actually work and how you almost accrue the benefits. Yeah. This has changed over time, so it started off as sort of a final salary pension was the main type of pension that you'd look at, and to keep that simple, it essentially looked at either the final salary you had in the last year of your working life or the last few, and then times that essentially by the amount of time that you've spent in the scheme. More recently, because they're seen as very valuable pensions and they're quite expensive for employers to fund, they've moved to a career average type scheme with some of the public sector ones, where instead of taking your last year's salary, they essentially take your average salary over the course of your working life.
Definitely, and if we think about that in the private world, it used to be quite common for people to have a defined benefit pension. Nowadays, because the cost of providing that income is expensive for employers, they've been gradually phased out, and there's very few schemes that we still see going now. Joe and myself, we will never have a defined benefit pension income, and we're always going to be having the defined contribution pots that grow over time with contributions and investment growth. So it's really a completely different philosophy, and sometimes people with a defined benefit pension go, oh well, I'm frustrated because I haven't got the flexibility to pick what income I want or when I retire, and I'm stuck with the income I'm given. And that is one of the, I suppose, criticisms. But then take that the other way and you say, if you're a member of a defined benefit scheme, you never have to pay any charges, you never have to see any investment risk, and you build up your pension simply by working, and it's about the volume of years worked and then how your salary increases over time gives you that income. In general, we are pension transfer specialists as a firm. We help people think about the defined benefit pension and think about whether it makes sense to move it across to the defined contribution world. The FCA, our regulator, would say that the majority of people should accept the scheme pension because it's in their best interest, unless there's a real key driver to move away. Some of those key drivers include better death benefits, more flexibility, and potentially being able to retire earlier. So that's some of the bits we're going to sort of touch upon today.
Yeah, I feel like Matthew said, it's almost like the first point of call for any final salary or career average pension is to remain in the scheme, and the reason for that is when you look at who the risk lies with. When you're in a final salary pension, the risk of providing your income lies with the employer. You're not putting any of your capital at risk, whereas when you're looking at sort of a defined contribution scheme, you're taking that into your own hands in terms of the investments that you invest in, and then also the responsibility to draw down on it at a sustainable rate. We'll touch on it a little bit later, final salary schemes, if something does go wrong in the back end and it's not fully funded, there are sort of, I suppose, stop losses in place to essentially allow someone else to take over that pension in terms of the pension protection fund, which we'll touch on.
Yeah, so essentially, you're never, as a member of a defined benefit pension scheme, you're never at risk of that pension disappearing because, as Joe mentions there, if something did happen and that employer or that pension was insolvent and didn't have enough assets to provide you with that income, you would have, as a minimum, 90% of that income provided by the pension protection fund. So when people get in touch to talk to us about pensions and they say, okay, I've got a defined benefit pension, for example, often they're quoting a transfer value, often known as a cash equivalent transfer value, and they might say, my pension is worth this much money. That's a bit of a funny bit that people can be confused about, because really that's not necessarily the value of the pension, that's an actuarial calculation that the scheme's offered them to leave the scheme. So again, these are all the bits that people could go, if I don't understand pensions, I'm not sure what I'm thinking about, the easiest thing to understand with a defined benefit pension is to look at the projections for what they'll give you as a guaranteed income in retirement. If we were talking to someone who was 55 who was looking to retire at, say, 58, you might be saying, understand your options, understand what the guaranteed income could look like, understand what the transfer value is, but why would you want to act, now? You're going to wait in that scheme because you might still be accruing benefits. There's no charges and there's no investment risk there.
Yeah, on the topic of taking benefits and I suppose misconceptions with regards to final salary pensions, we have a lot of clients come to us and say, my normal retirement date is 60, 65, I'm unable to access my DB final salary pension before then, and I have to wait. Matthew, do you just want to sort of run through a little bit with regards to what a normal pension age is and what it actually means when we're getting towards retirement?
Yeah, so currently anyone who reaches 55 can access their pensions. That's the same for a defined contribution pension or a defined benefit pension. That is going up in line with the state pension age. So in a few years' time that will be 57. But essentially, for the simplicity of it, as soon as anyone gets to that age, their pensions open and they've got a button available to say, yes, I'd like to start that pension. You don't have to wait to a normal pension age. That is just purely for illustrative purposes, and for a defined benefit pension scheme, that might be the point where you can take it with no penalties. So every year that you would take that defined benefit pension before that, you're then going to have another year, when you're living and receiving that income, so they're going to knock your income down accordingly, and that's known as an early retirement factor. So to answer the sort of question that people are asking about, okay, am I locked in until that age? No, that age is purely a starting point for the conversations. It might be what the pension was designed to provide income from, but any individual still has that flexibility from 55. There can be complicated times when someone could access it younger, for example, linked to a redundancy or something like that, and there can be complicated times when people can't access it even though they are 55, maybe because of a guaranteed income and there's not enough money in some element of a pot to provide it. We'll ignore those cases in this case because that's a very specialist area and someone who would definitely need advice. But from a high level point of view, whether you've got a defined contribution or a defined benefit pension, you can choose when you can afford to retire based on either the defined contribution pot and the income that you think you can take from it, or the defined benefit pension and the income that they tell you you will take. We often get the likes of people in the NHS scheme saying, okay, my statement from 55 or 57 looks like I'm penalised a lot for going early compared to 60 or 65. And that's true. That's saying, you're going to live for another 5 years or 10 years, depending on how early you go in that scenario. So therefore, they're dropping that down. And if you think about it from a scheme point of view, if they're committing to give you that guaranteed income for life, they are obviously going to reduce that because you're going to live longer by essentially have it paid for longer.
Yeah, I think it's interesting Matthew added in about the NHS pension there, because if you do have a pension with them, civil service, teacher's pension, something like like that, you can always log into their online portal and use a slider to essentially look at what it would be if you were to retire at 55, 57 or whatever. Other schemes, other private schemes, it might not be possible to do that, but you can always get in touch with the trustees and have a look and play with it that way. I think as Matthew said there, even though it is a penalty to take it early, it can sometimes make sense because it's essentially the same income that's spread across a longer time period.
One of the sort of common things someone says with a defined benefit pension is, okay, what are my options? So in simple sense, you would say you have the option of when you take it. You then have an option of, are you taking the maximum tax-free cash or are you taking no tax-free cash for a higher guaranteed income? And then your third option can be to transfer away and move across from that guaranteed pension into the defined contribution world, and we'll talk about that a bit later. When we think about the option of taking the tax-free cash, people sometimes knowledge is a bit scary and people know about 25% available to take from a pension. 25% doesn't apply in this world because it's done by commutation factors, and essentially the scheme says this is how much your total guaranteed income is reduced by to pay out that tax-free cash, and this is the figure that you can have. People often look at that transfer value and say, why can't I have 25% of that? Because that's what would happen in the defined contribution world. So really that can be quite a confusing area for people. The longer that you work for, and then when you accept that scheme pension, because that scheme pension is higher, that tax-free cash will also be higher. So that's the other thing to think about if you're taking it early.
Yeah, I think again when we are looking at sort of scheme pensions, when you do get your annual benefit statement, a lot of the time, as Matthew alluded to there, you'll get a couple of different figures. One will be essentially the maximum scheme pension, which is the maximum annual pension that you could be paid if you essentially forgo all the tax-free cash. They'll also give you another option 2, where there's a lower annual pension, and because you've accepted a lower pension, they'll give you a higher tax-free cash amount. And it's not binary, you don't have to take one or the other, you can take somewhere in between, and that's something where I think if you're at retirement, it is worth sitting down and looking at how much capital do you need. Are you looking at paying off a mortgage? Do you have any holidays planned? In which case you might want to take a higher level of tax-free cash, or would you actually prefer a higher income? And that income, for the most part, will increase in line with inflation, which I think is probably actually a good point to move on to now, which is another big benefit of final salary pensions, in the fact that if you were looking in the flexible world, it's your responsibility again to make sure that those investments grow, hopefully above inflation, because if not, you're essentially reducing your buying power. With defined benefit pensions, that's essentially already built in within the scheme, and it can vary with regards to which scheme you're in. But Matthew, do you just want to run through a little bit about sort of, I suppose, the power of the inflation linking that's in those schemes?
Yeah, I think when people think about the income that they need in retirement and what their expenditure will look like, they often have a magic number in mind, which might be, okay, we currently have a household income of £2,000, £3,000, £4,000, whatever the money coming in is. They then say, okay, in retirement we see our expenditure dropping by X, Y, Z, therefore we're probably going to need a magic number of, say, £2,000 or £2,500 in retirement per month. When you get a quote from a pension provider looking at your defined benefit pension, you'll get an annual pension, but the bit that people don't always think about is that that's going to keep pace with inflation for the long term. If you compare that to having your own pot that has to grow, in Joe's scenario, you're having to keep that working, you're going to have to keep that pot invested to generate those extra spending power and those extra returns, and that can be really beneficial, especially we've seen some high inflation environments recently, Russia, Ukraine, Liz Truss, all of those economic factors that have led to higher inflation, and we've lived through that recently, so that can be a really good benefit. People tend to know about the state pension, which again has that triple lock to be as a minimum inflation linked. So if you've got a defined benefit pension and then a future state pension to come, you've got two guaranteed sources of income that keep pace with inflation, and you're then thinking, if your expenditure drops over time, actually you could get to a point where your income's increasing but your expenditure hasn't. One of just touching on that thing about tax-free cash that you mentioned there, people might say, okay, what do people typically do? Probably 90 something % of people will say, I'll have the maximum tax-free cash, please, because one, it's tax-free and the additional income will be taxable over the long term. And they've also are likely to do more in the early years of retirement. So most people are saying, I'll have that tax-free cash and then I will, do with it what I want to achieve some of my objectives. The only time that people would say, actually, I'll give up that tax-free cash for the higher scheme pension is typically, if the income level is really important, if they're not quite at a position where they can afford it, that can be really beneficial just to say, I'll give that up. And it can also depend how it aligns with tax allowances. If their income was going to be fully utilising the personal allowance, again, they could say it's technically going to be more personal, more taxable income, but I'm not going to pay extra tax on it up until the state pension age, for example.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, another potential scenario where you might take a higher scheme pension. Actually, just earlier today, I was speaking with a client who had that almost Goldilocks scenario that we spoke about at the start of they've got a good amount in flexible pensions and they've got a good amount in sort of DB pensions as well. So in that scenario, because they've already got a flexible income, you can have a little bit more of a conversation about, do we take a higher scheme pension?
Yeah, definitely. I think if we jump up to the higher level and say, what are the pros and the cons of the defined benefit pension? The clear pros that we mentioned are no investment risk, no charges, and that inflation-linked element. If you then were to say, what are the negatives? People can sometimes get frustrated by the lack of flexibility and the death benefits. So the death benefits is a good one to jump onto next. Typically, a scheme will pay a spouse's pension, usually 50%, sometimes a little bit more, but usually 50%, and there'll be a 5-year guarantee period. So that's priced in for the member regardless of their scenario. So I had a client recently who's not got any family, was looking at his pension options, and he said, well, why am I paying for, a spouse's pension when I haven't got anyone to benefit from it? Why can't I give that up to have a higher pension in the same way you could with an open market annuity? And that's a valid point for him. Again, if you had children and they were grown up, they wouldn't benefit. So if you were a single parent, you might say, I would rather sacrifice that sort of spouse's pension or some of the other elements of it to get my children to be able to benefit. There's no options available within the scheme rules. They can provide for children in full-time education up to age 23, but again, for most people at retirement, they're thinking more about the long term and the flexibility. And we often have people inquiring saying, I have a transfer value of 300,000, £1 million, whatever it might be, and just saying, okay, the risk here is, if I'm a single parent, if I was to be hit by a bus the day after I retired, my estate would get 5-year guarantee period paid, and then that's it. Why isn't there anything else I could think about? And that is where someone, comes and says, what is the transfer value and what could I do with that defined contribution to help provide for loved ones? Again, we know, as we've talked about previously, the defined contribution can be left nominated to anyone, and you could even buy an annuity to almost replicate or be similar to a scheme pension, and you could build it up to a 30-year guarantee, so that can be a lot more beneficial. But, devil's advocate, to achieve the better death benefits, you are giving up something. So you're either giving up the guaranteed element or you're giving up the inflation element. So it's a sort of a seesaw approach to what someone's looking to achieve. What do you sort of see as the most common frustrations with a scheme pension?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably the flexibility point, isn't it, when you're looking at a scheme pension. I mean, over the sort of last few episodes that we've spoken about the different retirement journeys that people go on. Yeah. And it's not, well, more commonly now, it's not just stop and immediately retire, which, to be honest, with final salaries being, I suppose, more old-fashioned, they're more akin to the old-fashioned way of retiring, of working right the way up to that normal pension age that we've spoke about, then taking the scheme pension, and then they stop there. They never go back to work. I suppose how times have changed, we're now looking more at sort of a phased retirement, or I suppose maybe even stopping for a little bit, spending a bit more money in your early years, and then sort of taking your income down a little bit when you've done what you wanted, you've done all the travels. So that's, I suppose, the big limitation. It doesn't allow you, other than the potential sort of larger tax-free cash that we've mentioned, it doesn't allow you to vary your income throughout retirement. And I think that's one of the big benefits of having that sort of flexible income in terms of a drawdown account, which could help have almost alongside a scheme pension maybe.
Yeah, I think it depends. Everyone's scenario is different and everyone's sort of objectives is different. If someone's got a defined benefit pension and they've built up the guaranteed income, they might want to say, okay, my employer's changed the scheme and that's been frozen, so that will just sort of carry on behind the scenes, every year be increased by inflation, but then I'm now in a defined contribution pension, and that's that best of both, that Hovis approach that we sometimes think about, because what you've got there is that flexible pension can then be built up ahead of retirement, and you can use that for your flexibility and potentially use that for some of your death benefits, which then allows you to potentially accept the scheme pension. For those people who are thinking about the transfer values and are thinking about moving from the defined benefit world to the defined contribution world, they have to have a toleration for risk. They have to have, approach to risk and experience to say, I'm willing to see my values fluctuate. I'm willing to see my values potentially fall 5% or 10% one year, to then think over the long term investment returns will pick up. And I think that's a key point, that the scheme pension, just like the annuity, is perfect for that low risk individual. One area that we've had people asking questions about recently is transfer values. So if someone's actively looking at their transfer value, thinking about moving across, they will have noticed transfer values are lower now than they were 4 or 5 years ago. Why is that? That's all linked to interest rates, gilt yields. Essentially, the higher inflation's been and the higher interest rates are, the cheaper it can be for the scheme to provide that guaranteed income for members. So that brings that actuarial calculation down, and it gives people a lower amount to transfer away. So those people who I mentioned earlier who often say the value of my defined benefit pension is X, what they're looking at is that actuarial calculation, and they will have seen that drop quite significantly.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning on that to bump in. Like Matthew says, we do have a lot of people coming in saying, oh, my pension's dropped in value. The key thing there is the scheme pension will have actually increased in value over even the course of a year through inflation.
Yeah, 100%. It's what is being valued. You sort of say the value is the guaranteed income. The transfer value, the cash equivalent transfer value, is that money that they will give you to move away. So for people who have seen them fall, should they be worried? Not particularly. Again, it's if the FCA would say that the majority of people are going to access the scheme pension, that's the starting point. For someone whose scenario is, okay, I want more flexibility, or I want better death benefits, or I want, I've got a specific need, or potentially, I'm in ill health. Again, someone who's got a reduced life expectancy would look at the scheme pension and say, it might give me great income up to normal life expectancy, but I'm expecting to have a shortened life expectancy. I would rather take the transfer value and then do something else with it. They're the sorts of conversations we have as a pension transfer specialist, and as a firm who operates in this area. We can have those sensible conversations with someone to balance the pros and the cons to see what works for them in line with their wider financial picture. Yeah,
I think, reiterating that, if that is something that you are thinking about, you should always make sure that you're speaking to a regulated financial advisor. There has been schemes in the past, I suppose, where they've been pushed to move out of a DB pension without fully understanding all the benefits. So always speak to a pension transfer specialist where you can to make sure you understand both the benefits within the scheme and the risks of transferring out.
And there is that that minimum figure of £30,000, where if someone has a transfer value above that, they have to get advice in order to transfer. Some people get frustrated by that because they say, George Osborne stood up and talked about pension flexibility and freedom, but why does that not apply to me? That was put in very much to protect members so they weren't accidentally giving up something that was valuable. And it might seem frustrating if you're the person who goes, I have a transfer value of 31,000, for example, but they had to pick a number and it was there so that people weren't accidentally giving up the guaranteed income, which was inflation linked, and had those really strong benefits, and that was why it was in place. There have been rumours about that value increasing. Again, it hasn't increased in my working life, but there's talk of maybe it being a bit higher because there's also what's called an advice gap, where if someone has a transfer value of £40,000 or £50,000 and rings round firms to say, can you advise me on this? It's a high risk transaction, so the firm might say, we're not willing to provide advice on it. And again, that can be a hard one because someone has to get advice if they want to do it, but then a firm might say, okay, you don't hit our criteria to go through with insurers or other things like that.
Yeah, okay, great. I think what would be good now, because to be honest, the NHS is the biggest employer in the UK, and the vast majority of people that have defined benefit pensions will be in probably publicly funded schemes. One question that I occasionally get popped up is with regards to AVCs on a NHS pension or other. So that could be sort of additionally voluntary contributions, and what that essentially allows you to do if it's a money purchase AVC. I'm getting into jargon again. I realise that Matthew is about to press a button. Essentially, what that allows you to do is build up sort of a flexible pot alongside your final salary or career average scheme with the NHS, and when it comes to the decision on how much annual income you take versus how much tax-free cash, that can help you commute over into the higher tax-free cash sum without giving up as much annual income. So I thought that was one thing that would be good to touch on there.
Yeah, I think to try and simplify what Joe said there, basically the AVC is a flexible pot that is linked to your guaranteed income, and the really positive bit is when you come to use it, you could use that pot to provide tax-free cash, and then when we talked earlier about giving up some of the scheme pension for the tax-free cash, you don't have to give up as much. So that's one of the positives for that. You see, the NHS is a funny one because most people who are inquiring about NHS pensions recently, it's all about the McLeod ruling. And again, we won't go into too much detail about that, but that's essentially saying at some point people have been discriminated against when it comes to age, so they've almost been moved between one pension to another, and then this ruling's come back to say schemes like the NHS have to almost look at that and roll it back, or give people the options to roll it back so they haven't been disadvantaged. That can be frustrating for some people at the minute who go, I'm ready to retire, but I can't get an accurate figure for what I'll be given because I've got a pension that's almost between two places. So I do see that, and that is frustrating. But the NHS, it has the resource and has the sort of pension departments that can give you those numbers and give you that statement. It might just be that challenging time to get it. I read an article this week which I sort of laughed at a little bit, that was the teachers' pension were being so slow in replying to people who wanted figures for divorces, that some divorces were being sort of eked out for an extra 6 months. So again, it's not just the people who are accessing pensions that can find these things frustrating. Sometimes it can be the pure logistics of separating assets and seeing what people's pensions are worth. It's worth touching on that, I suppose. If you were having a divorce and you had a defined contribution pension and your partner had a defined benefit pension, how do you value those against each other? That's a really complicated area, and we sometimes get inquiries of people coming through, certainly through solicitors, to say, this is the scenario, what should we do to level it up, or is there anything I can do personally once the divorce has happened to then put money back into my pension to help with my security going forward. So there's lots of points to look at. Sometimes on divorce they don't let the non-member stay in the scheme. So if I had a transfer value and it was going to be given to an ex-spouse, they might not be allowed to stay in the defined benefit scheme. That was a worrying fire alarm, but we'll just ignore that, and we'll carry on like pros. So any other question that you think we might have in relation to defined benefit pensions?
I suppose we've covered quite a lot of them. One of the ones that I was wanting to look through was, a lot of people are concerned what happens if my employer goes bust when you've got a defined benefit scheme. We've almost covered that already in the pension protection fund. I'll refer us over to Matthew as a pension transfer specialist, but as he's mentioned, it's sort of 90% pre-retirement age, and if you're in payment, is it right, Matthew, that it's 100% when it's in payment?
Yeah, the only thing that this can sometimes knock down is the escalation. If you had a really good escalation in the scheme, that could drop slightly, and if the death benefits were better than 50%, again, that can potentially drop down. But the headline figures are to say, you're protected to 100% of your pension if it's in payment, or 90% if it's not. One of the other things that I think is worth mentioning is underfunded schemes. So why would an employer or scheme go bust? Again, it could be because the employer's not put enough money in over time. The regulator wants people, employers, to be maintaining their pension scheme and putting money in. Gordon Brown, I think it was, who made employers put their pension deficit, or their liability essentially, on their balance sheet. So companies were looking at it a lot more, and that was some of the reasons why some companies, were sold for £1 when really, PHS and people like that, it might be the pension deficit might have been a few £1 million. So the company was almost passed around for £1 because of that liability. Overall, when you look at an underfunded scheme, you could start to worry that they won't be able to provide you with full benefits, but we've mentioned already there's protection available, and there's also been more and more focus of those employers putting more money in to get that back up to a fully funded status.
Yeah, great. And I suppose as the final common question that I've got today, and I say common, it doesn't come about too much, but we've spoke quite a lot about early retirement. Some people come to us if they've got particularly early retirement dates of maybe 60 or 65, and they're not yet ready to retire. They go, well, do I have to take it, or can I continue to sort of work without taking the pension?
Yeah, so the simple answer to that would be you should have a late retirement factor in the same way that there's an early retirement factor, and therefore by taking it later you're expecting to draw it over a lower period of time, and therefore you should be paid more. But not every scheme has that, so you want to check the scheme rules. I've seen pension schemes in the past that if you work past the normal retirement age, you don't get anything more. So regardless if you're working or not, you should press the button to start taking it. I think that's probably the key answer to that one. We've also got, people who say, I'm going to work past the state pension age. Again, technically you can defer that, but very few people would do because it's not that beneficial anymore. So it's all about factoring in, what you're looking to achieve your income, and then when and how do you turn these incomes on.
Yeah, sure. So I suppose good time to summarise, or do you have anything else that you want to cover, Matthew?
No, I think the only thing I would say is it feels like a simple topic because it is guaranteed, but actually it becomes more complicated because you can have lots of edge cases, and you can have someone who says, oh, well, I've been with my partner for 30 years, but we're not married and we're not planning to. Again, scheme rules can be very specific to say it's a spouse's pension. So therefore, it would be at trustee's discretion whether they would pay to a partner who's lived with you for that period of time. We've written away to a lot of schemes to ask their opinion. At times, some of them say yes, living as partners would count them. Others have said, no, we wouldn't count them. So you do have to think about your scenario and think about what's best for you. And it's really a key area to get advice on because, it's the sort of thing you don't want to get wrong.
Yeah, I think that pretty much summarises it, and I'm happy with that. It is an area that you really do need to seek advice on, whether it's as simple as deciding how much tax-free cash you want to take from the scheme pension or otherwise. I think it's worth looking at it so that you don't get it wrong, because it is essentially the income for life.
Definitely, and if anyone's got any specific questions they want us to cover, leave them in the comments below. As always, please like and subscribe, and we look forward to speaking to you next Tuesday.